G'day. Today we're replacing some wheel bearings, rear wheel bearings, or axle bearings, independent rear suspension on a VZ Commodore. So we start by supporting the vehicle safely. Always a good idea to give the vehicle a bit of a push, make sure it doesn't fall off any stands you've got. Take the wheels off. Now we're just going to remove the brake caliper. 2 bolts in the rear there, on the inside. They're 19mm on the calipers. Good idea to use a breaker bar because they usually are on very tight. Okay, supported on a box there. Important not to damage that hose or the fittings there. Pop the rotor off. It's a good idea to just check these handbrake shoes, make sure they're all okay, and also your brake pads, your disc brake pads. Now we've marked the CV joint or the drive shaft from the diff, the one that goes from the diff to the axle. Mark that and make sure it's nice and clean before you remove it. 8mm Allen key. Okay, I've got that CV end off, and just pop that out of the way. Now we've got that out of the way. You can just sort of lever it. It will be under tension from where the ball and cages are, and you'll find that nut is 32mm or 1.25 inches. These are locked in on there. I just use a punch like that. You just tap it in there, in that little slot, and you'll be able to loosen it a bit easier. If you get a brass drift, you can tap it out that way through there. But you'll notice that you don't have enough thread there on those bolts. So what I'm going to do is just put a couple of clamps, one clamp there and there. It's on spline, so it's not too difficult to come out. There we go. Just be careful the inside hub doesn't fall out. They are in very hard. If you're going to try and knock them in or knock them out from the inside, just make sure you don't damage that thread. You can get a punch, like a brass drift or a solid steel punch, but just make sure you make a little point in it so it sits in that center hole, and just tap it out. You can see there's a circlip there, so you just pinch that circlip, pull it out, the bearing comes out. And on this hub, we need to get a hub pull or bearing puller on that in our press and just pull it out. Just tap it evenly out, top and bottom. Just cleared that circlip where the circlip was. Now you got to do the bottom one. Yeah. If you go too hard on one side, it'll just get cocked to one side and get locked up. You can see why it's important to make sure your vehicle's suspended properly, especially when you've got to do this sort of work. You don't knock the whole car over onto yourself. Nearly that. Slowly. Ta-da! You can see it's actually got 2 bearings in one sleeve. So now we've got to pull that bit of broken bearing off that little stub axle. There we go. Now I've cleaned all the surface in there nicely and blown it out so the bearing can go in quite easily. And there actually are a few different ways where you can replace these bearings. Pull the whole thing off and take it in somewhere where they can press it out and get it apart and replace it. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is getting the bearing and tapping it in. You risk doing damage to it or putting it in, cocking it to one side or damaging the bearing. If you are going to knock it in, make sure you put the bearing in first. You tap it on the outside, on the outer ring, not on the inner ring, or you can damage the bearing. The third way to do it is to have a driver like this. This one goes on the inside. That's just a bit of water pipe. Or you probably could use a socket on the other side. It that way is that you've got an uneven surface here. So when you're pulling it in, it'll be pulling it to one side if you're threading it in with like a nut and bolt. And you've got to make sure the driver we've got here only needs to push it in past that circlip so you can put the circlip in. But you want to make sure it's a little bit smaller so it doesn't get stuck in there. And the fourth way, this extension bar, 3/4 drive, and that new bearing can just sit over that. Put it in the freezer. It's about 1.3 degrees. We've got our heat gun, and this one can go up to 400 degrees. We're on about 45. We'll heat it up, try and get it to about 100 degrees. To about 100 degrees. All the way in. Just give that a bit of a tap there. You want to make sure that that's just hitting on the outside ring. Just, that's it. Yep, you can hear it when it hits the end. Put the circlip back in. And when you get the circlip in there, you just want to tap it, just one end. You just want to make sure that it's properly seated in that groove. Yeah, that's seated nicely. And you'll hear it when it hits the end, it'll sound different. Inner flange on, you need to warm it up. I think you've got to warm it up to at least 80 degrees for it to go in easily on the splines. We're only trying to make this expand just so it slides on a bit easier. And when it's warmed up, it's gone all the way in. You still have to tighten it with the nut there. And we've got this little lock plate there. Just put that over. And we're just going to crimp it, just tap it with a punch, just so it locks in there, so it can't spin out. The inner part of the CV joint up here, it actually holds all that from falling out. Anyway, you'll see there's probably a little, just up there, a bit hard to see from this spot. Oh, can't see it. There we go. There's a little raised bit there, just at the top, on two opposite ends, and that little plate on the CV, that one there, that just holds that in from popping out, and it stops that lock nut from coming off. You can see I've just tapped it there and there, just so it locks into that little square bit there on the edges, and that'll stop it from spinning around. Now we can't get that CV in because on this side it's hitting on top of the exhaust there. So we've got to actually put it together, lift the wheel up so that hub is up higher so we can put the CV on. So in the meantime, we'll put the caliper back on, put the rotor back on, put the wheel back on, and we can do that up from the inside. Rotor on, calipers on. Now we've just got to put the wheel on, lift it up, just so we can get that CV back in. Okay, we've lowered it back down onto the hoist, and you can see now we can actually move this around. It's not hitting the exhaust. There we go, all bolted up. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Throw me a beer if any of this information has helped, or if I deserve one. Thank you for watching.